all of you can see my screen, right? Okay, great. So this is mostly slides just to make sure that, like, in the initial phases, I can at least sort of just to guide my initial discussion and just to sort of timeline how I have sort of gotten into research. So quick, preliminaries about who I am and what I do. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon. Before this, I was an undergrad at IIT Kharagpur, where I got my undergrad and master's. Yeah, like it was an integrated 5-year BTech MTech program in electrical engineering. So that's also an interesting transition, right? Like, how did I move from EE to doing HCI? And I think during my undergrad years, I spent like 2 very pivotal summers, one in Microsoft Research India and the other at Stanford HCI, which sort of were a large part of how I ended up doing HCI. So I'll talk a bit more about how I ended up there and what I learned through those opportunities as well. And yeah. So I started in Kharagpur in 2015, right? And this is when I just entered as like an electrical engineering major. And naturally, like the first couple of years, I was just trying to survive and figure things out. And I spent a lot of time taking very technical courses. So I had courses in analog electronics, digital electronics, VLSI design. And the summer of my second year, I spent the whole summer, because at that point in time, I was like, okay, I'm an electrical engineering student. Maybe I should do things that electrical engineering students do. So I spent the second year working in the VLSI lab, which was like VLSI is very large scale integration. So we are basically laying out circuits and things like that and designing circuits for new kinds of operations. And I spent the whole summer, right, working on this. And I realized that I didn't really enjoy doing this. Like, I did it, and I did it because everyone around me was doing it, and because like I was equipped to do it, but I didn't really enjoy the process, and I didn't really know why at that time, right?
Just to ask from there, in India also, do you have like summer breaks and
So we get our summer break at the end of every year, during which most people spend that time interning. Earlier, you don't. Like first, second year, you usually explore, but around third, fourth year, you usually spend it interning. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Right. And so I had this disastrous summer, right, where I spent the summer doing VLSI and I had not enjoyed it at all. And I came back to college really confused about what I wanted to do. And at the time, I was doing a minor in computer science. So I ended up taking this course on natural language processing. And naturally, like, it seemed very interesting, right? Because anyone that's like just hearing about a new field feels that way, I think. So I was taking this course on NLP, and I really enjoyed the course itself. And at the end of the course, I got involved in a project, just as part of the course, right? Like we had a term project, and I got involved in a project for the course. And so I really liked it so far. And so I reached out to a couple of researchers at a lot of places across India just to say, hey, I really like NLP. I know nothing about the field, but I would love it if you would give me the opportunity to come learn with you, right? And one person sort of took bait, right? Like one researcher at MSR was sort of pretty excited by my enthusiasm. So he said, okay, why don't you interview with us? And so I interviewed with them, and he was like, okay, so looks like you can come hang with us during the summer. So I ended up
just to interrupt here, MSR, I don't know whether undergraduates know, but this is Microsoft Research Unit, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so Microsoft Research has a center in India, and it's also a pretty great place for people generally in South Asia. So there's people from Bangladesh, there's people from a lot of places that come there to work and intern. So I'd say it's a great hub. So you can also consider applying there if you're really excited about CS problems in general. So I ended up at MSR India, and this is when I was really excited about NLP, right? So I thought I would go to Microsoft Research India, and this was a internship with the multilingual systems group. So I thought I'd be training some, deep learning architectures and really doing some, cutting edge NLP research. And I arrived there, and my advisor sort of tells me that we have this interesting problem now. And the interesting problem is that we want to know if we should build chatbots that can mix languages. So this happens in India, and I'm pretty sure this happens in Sri Lanka probably too, where if you know and speak more than one language, it's very common for people to mix languages while speaking. So it's very common for me to start out saying something in Hindi and then end in English, or start in English and end in Hindi. And we really want to figure out, if we should build chatbots that can also do this. Like, should a chatbot be able to talk to people in this mixed language? And the interesting problem here is not how to build it, but whether we should build it. And I'll tell you why that's an interesting problem. Because to build such a chatbot, you would have to create a data set, right? You would have to collect a lot of data, that this multilingual corpora that would have English and Hindi sentences probably parallelly translated. And then you need to build generative models to sort of generate sentences where you mix languages nicely and naturally. This is a lot of investment of time and energy and resources, right? Because you have to curate data, you have to build models. Possibly a lot of people are going to spend time doing this. And you're also going to spend a lot of money doing this. And is that a valuable thing to do? Like, is this even something people will like after we spent all this time and money building? Will people want to use this? And so you understand how there's this deadlock, right? Like, you can't know if people will want to use it unless you build it, but you don't want to build it unless you know people are really going to use it, right? And so what do you really do in this situation? And this is part of why I really like HCI. It's because it's essentially sending a postcard from the future. So Scott Clemmer calls HCI prototyping basically writing a postcard to yourself from the future. So what you want to do is temporarily take yourself into a future where this technology exists, figure out what that world looks like, whether people use it, how people use it, and then send back a postcard to your current self telling you how you should build it, right? And so I'm going to describe to you now how we ended up doing this. And this is part of like how I started my pivot into HCI. So we designed this human in the loop system, right? Which after I become more familiar with HCI literature, I know now is what we call a Wizard of Oz system. And so there was this wizard in between. So we said we want something that makes it look as real as a chatbot. So we don't want, let's say, me talking to a person and pretending I'm a chatbot, because there's certain mistakes that a chatbot makes typically that a human won't make in a conversation. So we want to make it as similar as possible to a conversation with a chatbot. But at the same time, we want to be able to change things the way we want, add language mixing and things like that. So we said, okay, let's start with the English chatbot. So at the base, we have this English chatbot. And we said, let's build a wrapper around this English chatbot that basically translates sentences into English. So if the person enters like a mixed language message, like a English message, it'll translate it to English, get the response from the chatbot, and then translate that message from the chatbot back into English. So the user only sees English, right? Now the question is, how do you build this wrapper, right? This wrapper is also non-trivially built. So we decided to just keep a person there. The person is the wrapper. The person is the translator. Person doesn't have to do any thinking. They don't have to really think of a good response, right? All they have to do is translate the user's message, which is probably mixed language, into English. Our bot is going to generate a response for that English message. And we are going to tell this person to intelligently translate that English response back into English. And if you see the CM policy at the bottom, that's sort of what we call a code mixing policy. And that was an engine that would control how this bot would mix languages, because that is also a non-trivial problem, right? Figuring out how to do this well. Like, you can't just randomly mix languages. And so essentially what we built is a Wizard of Oz system where, there's a person interfacing with a bot and people and the user who come into the system. And this is neat because now you see with minimal setup, really, we have not really spent as much money as we would have to curate data XYZ. But we have this proof of concept that let us figure out if people, at least the user, like speaking to a bot that can mix languages, right? And this is sort of what ended up becoming a paper later that I will talk about. But what I wanted to highlight from this experience was the fact that HCI typically is very interested in figuring out what we should build. And what a lot of other courses and other areas of research will look at is, what we can build, how we can build it best, how we can build it most efficiently, cost effectively. And I think HCI is really sort of mainstay is figuring out, what to do with all of that you can build, what you should build. So that's one thing I would like you to take away from this mini experience of mine. But yeah, so after that internship at MSR, right, where I sort of pivoted more into HCI, what ended up happening is I continued working on this project even once I went back to Kharagpur. And that was a great experience because the group I was in was fundamentally an NLP group, right? So none of us were HCI researchers, which was great because all of us would just keep bugging the HCI researchers we knew and asked them, okay, this is the problem we're working on. What is the best way to do this? What is the best way to do that? What are the best practices here? And it was a great experience because all of us were learning together, and nobody was more experienced than the others in terms of doing HCI research. And what ended up happening is I continued working on that project. And a project life cycle is typically pretty long. So, especially if you're in industry, you have to apply for a review board clearance, and which typically takes longer in industry just because they have to make sure that that you're really not putting the company in trouble. You're doing ethical things to your participants in studies and things like that. So it usually takes around a year to really write a paper, get it accepted. And so this is process that's going on in the background. Meanwhile, I'm back in Kharagpur doing courses, figuring out, what I'm going to do with life and next summer probably. And around that time, I got lucky and got this scholarship from the Indian government that basically said that, okay, and this was partly hinged on the fact that I had decent grades and I had this experience at MSR and, I had decent letters of recommendation. So I got a scholarship from the Indian government that said, okay, we'll pay for your air tickets, we will give you a stipend, find a host professor that will host you for an internship in the US and you can go. And so again, I got back to work. I started reaching out to people, writing emails, saying I'm really excited about HCI. And now you see, earlier I was saying I was really excited in NLP. I know nothing, but I'm ready to learn. Now, 1 year later, the message is I'm really excited in HCI. Again, I don't know anything because I've just sort of moved into this field, right? So in 2009, I was sending out messages saying, hey, this is my experience so far. This is what I've done. And, I'm really excited in HCI. These are the kinds of problems I want to work with. But I think the main difference was now I sort of had a sense of how to think about problems, and also because I had worked on this research problem, I could also think of problems coming out of this. So naturally, one next problem that I suggested was, okay, like let's say you have this bot. We figured out that, okay, users really like to speak these multilingual bots. So I decided to, think further, what is the natural extension of this? And part of me was still in that mindset where I am, coming from an NLP background. So I was like, hey, what if we have some sort of banded feedback system that can learn over time what people's preferences are for mixing languages? Like some people might really like to mix languages, some people might not. And part of this relates to, how people think of their chatbots. If I think of my chatbot as my friend, I might want it to mix languages with me because it's kind of informal, right? But let's say I think of my chatbot less as a friend and more as like an assistant, then I probably don't want it to mix languages. And so through some sort of banded feedback based on how people are using language themselves, can I learn how this bot should? And I wrote to a bunch of professors saying, hey, this is what I worked on. This is my idea. Would you be interested in hosting me for something?
How did you select which professors that you should write to?
Yeah. So I obviously, now that I was moving sort of into the HCI space, I wanted someone who was definitely doing HCI research. But at the same time, it had to be someone who also had like some sort of understanding of how like machine learning systems work, just because that is my background, right? And Michael was sort of at that nice confluence where he was definitely an HCI researcher, a very well established HCI researcher, but he's also very well equipped with tools in all other domains. And so I reached out to Michael, who was one of the people I reached out to, and I told him like, this is what I've done so far. This is my idea. I think we should have some sort of banded optimization to learn these policies. And at that time, by some happenstance, his PhD student Ranjay was working on a very similar problem where they had a bot on Instagram that would ask people questions about their images. And they were figuring out through some sort of banded optimization how to ask people those questions. So, some people might respond if you are really nice to them. Some people might respond if you give them a compliment and then ask them the question. And so they were using banded feedback to really figure out these conversational strategies. And so it really seemed to fit well with what I was talking about. So I hopped on call with Ranjay, and Ranjay was really excited about it. And so I ended up at Stanford.
Just to make sure others know, Ranjay is the PhD student of Professor Michael Bernstein, where I developed the similar natural language processing research. Okay.
Yeah. So now I end up at Stanford. And first of all, I'm very overwhelmed, right? Just being surrounded by all these superstar researchers, superstar PhD students. Everyone's, and the thing is, it's not just that they're like really famous and really productive. It's just that they also work really hard, right? These people, they're really hardworking, they're really talented, and they're really like driven to their research. And so first of all, when I ended up there, I was like really overwhelmed by the fact that I'm surrounded by these really talented and hardworking people. And part of me was worried that, I wouldn't be able to rise to the, one sec. So part of me was like really worried that, will I be able to sort of match their level and just be able to perform at that level. And so I think what I really benefited from was really good guidance. So both Ranjay and Michael were really supportive, and they knew that I was sort of like really flustered. And so they gave me more like targeted work to do. So they said, hey, we are working towards this HCOM deadline that is in like 3-4 weeks. We don't need you to do anything. Don't do research. Don't think too much. Just help us do research, right? So we are working on a project. All you have to do is help us run experiments. We will tell you exactly what to do. You just do it, right? And this is a big part of like learning how to do research, is just helping other people do research, right? So very early on as an undergrad, you can't expect to have really good ideas, or you can't even expect to have ideas that will materialize into papers. But it's good to sort of get a sense of how research happens, what the processes are, what the way of thinking about research is. And you get a good sense of that just by helping someone else do their project, right? So a senior PhD student, a professor. And so on this project, I basically just helped Ranjay run experiments, and I collected the data, visualized the data, made the graphs, helped write the paper. There was not a lot of intellectual contribution from me, but what I did learn through this is, it got me into the momentum, of like doing research at that pace, and secondly, it taught me, how this group does research, how they communicate science, and how I should incorporate good practices of doing research into my own work, right? And I think the main thing I learned from, so this was sort of the general project that we were working on. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But I think what I really learned from this experience was that at least groups at the top level really value communicating research well. And this is something you don't really appreciate coming from India, at least. Because in India, you're like, okay, the work should speak for itself. But that is seldom the case. Everyone's doing really good research. But you also have to communicate it in a way that everyone is able to appreciate it. So writing good papers is very important. Writing good talks is very important. Creating good visualizations for your paper is very important. And this is something you learn only when you work with researchers who appreciate that, right? So now a bit about what exactly we did for this HCOM paper. So like I said, right, Ranjay was trying to deploy this agent that would ask people questions about their images and get responses. And we were basically trying to learn, what is the best social strategy to augment that question with. So let's say you're trying to ask someone, where is this place? You can sort of give them a compliment, or you can try to establish some sort of relation, like, hey, I also like the color black, where is this place? Or you can sort of, again, give the person a compliment, give the person who's posted the picture a compliment, give the picture a compliment. And so we really tried to figure out, how to do this and add it to our system to ask people questions about their images and get labels for a vision data set, right? So this is basically some sort of organic crowdsourcing where you're not really paying people, but you're getting their responses voluntarily to create labels. And this is another flavor of doing HCI research. Like my previous problem was saying, hey, what should we build? What should the future look like? And writing a postcard back to me. But if you look at this project is fundamentally different, right? Because in this project, you're doing something. You're actually doing something that's not been done before. And this is the second part of HCI, is where the costs of prototyping or the costs of building something are not very high. You can just actually build it, right? You can just actually build the thing and see and show that something new is possible and show that, a new future is possible right now. So one part of HCI is figuring out, what to build. What should I build? What should the future look like? The second is saying, hey, here's something new that was not possible before, but we can make it possible this way, and showing how it is possible. And this project sort of fit into that category where you were like, hey, we can actually build a system that asks questions about their images and gets their responses. And we can use that to build an image data set. So that's what this paper was. But again, this was not my intellectual contribution. Again, I was mainly there to help Ranjay and assist him and learn how to do research.
Just to pause over there, I want to emphasize the students that I'm putting the links that Pranav is saying in the chat box. Just make sure that you'll go through with that. And also the other thing that I want to highlight is like maybe you can tell how, because when people join research group, they don't know exactly like should they drive the research or should they wait until give the instructions to do the research. So maybe you can highlight that point of view as well. How did you take the initiatives?
Yeah, so I think the main thing to say, like, it's very important to communicate expectations well. So I think the main thing to do is sort of talk to whoever you're working with, right? Your mentor. You can be very open to them about what your level is, what your experience is, and also what your expectations are. So when I arrived at Stanford, like, I knew that I wasn't ready to lead a research project, right? And I knew that I very much needed some sort of guidance initially. So I was pretty open in communicating that, like, hey, I'm very enthusiastic to learn, but at the same time, I don't think like I'm ready to lead a project yet. So I would really like if you could sort of give me some sort of guidance initially, just so I can get a better sense of how to go about doing research, how you all operate, which would also then help me when I start out my own project, because that is the intention. Like, of course, I want to do something myself, but at the same time, I don't want to take on more than I can handle, right? And I think most advisors, when they work with you, most PhD students know that. Like, most PhD students are not expecting undergraduates or even early master students to really, lead a project. They know that, it takes some time to get adjusted to working in that environment. But yeah, I think just communicating more openly and letting them know what your expectations are, what your level is. And if you don't know how to do something, if they tell you, Pranav, can you go off and do this? And you don't know how to do it, the best thing to do is just to say there and then that, hey, I don't know how to do this. Like, or I didn't understand what you meant. Or, if they tell you to, like, read up something and you don't know what the source is, you ask there and then. So ask as many questions as you can. And make sure you're communicating as much as you can. So if you're stuck with anything, go talk to them. Like, don't try to pretend like you have things under control. It's easier for everyone, right? As long as you're learning. Yeah. So yeah, now that we were done with this HCOM deadline, I sort of had time, right? Now I'm done with the HCOM deadline. I have some momentum in doing research. And now I have to figure out what I'm going to do the rest of this summer, because the summer is still going on. I'm still interning there. And of course, now I have to do something myself, right? Because that would be my intellectual contribution. That would really make it worth my time, having done this internship, and worth their time as well. So now the interesting thing about research is, right, any problem you work on, it opens up more problems than it solves, right? Like, in general, I've noticed that any research paper you start to write, by the end, you have more problems than you've solved in the paper that you started out solving, or you have like problems that are related. So as you dig further, you get to see what's ahead, right? And so naturally, in this paper, what we did was we asked people questions about their images, and they were nice enough to give us responses to the board. And this sort of got me onto this line of thinking where I was like, okay, this is interesting, right? Because it is not obvious why someone would want to help a bot. So why is this not obvious? Like, think of Microsoft's Tay. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Tay, but basically Tay was a chatbot that Microsoft built, and they put it on Twitter. And the whole goal of Tay was very similar. Tay said, I'm going to learn through interactions with people. So as people continue to talk to me, I will get better at communicating and learning how to talk to people. And yet people are very quickly mean to Tay. So very quickly people started sending it trolling messages. People started being rude to Tay. And Tay learned to be rude to people in return, right? Because Tay was just, scraping the data and learning from the data. Tay also learned to be mean in the process. And finally, what ended up happening was Tay started to say a lot of problematic things, and Microsoft had to pull down Tay. And which is in very stark contrast to what happened with us, right? Like, we were also a bot. We were deployed on social media. People could have been mean to us. People could have given us irrelevant responses. And yet they chose to answer properly. So I was like, why is this the case? Why are people selectively nice to some agents and not nice to other agents? And so I started talking to Ranjay about this project. And Ranjay, of course, was very supportive. So Ranjay said, what? This is a great idea, but I'm not the expert in the field. Neither is Michael. So we should go talk to Jeff Hancock, who was a prof in the communications department at Stanford. And he basically had a background in doing research in psychology, social psychology. So what Ranjay did was he wrote a mail to Jeff Hancock saying, Pranav's an intern with us. This is what he's been interested in. Would you be interested in sort of giving us some guidance or pointing us in the right direction, in terms of papers? And Jeff Hancock is also nice, really great person. He also immediately responded. He's like, yeah, I'm really excited about this area in general, and I think y'all are onto something, so why don't y'all come and talk to me? And so I made a presentation. We went and met Jeff Hancock. And we told Jeff Hancock, why we are thinking, what we are thinking. And Jeff Hancock was also really interested. So he's like, what, this is really exciting. Let's collaborate on this and let's work on this. So that is it. You see how easy it was. It didn't really take me like months of reading papers and thinking about abstract problems, because that's seldom how you get like ideas. You get ideas by actually doing. So the more you involve yourself in doing research and just helping someone else do research, and just by getting your hands dirty in doing research, the more likely you are to hit new problems as you continue digging, I would say. So now I sort of have this situation where I'm leading the project. We have me, Ranjay, and Michael, and now Jeff Hancock has also joined as a collaborator. So now this puts a lot of pressure on me, right? Because I'm sort of leading this project, and all the expectations are there, right? Because of course, like they're hosting me as an intern, they expect that Pranav will do some valuable research, some sizable amount of research before he goes. And so what we did was I designed the study, and it was scoped out to be such that I could finish it, a sizable portion of it, within the rest of the time I had in my internship. Like, this was not the most ambitious project, I would say, strictly because I was there for a finite amount of time, and I wanted to execute well rather than do a lot. And I will get back to why it's important to execute well in a bit, but I'll just talk a bit about the study. So the study was simple. The study was, we're going to study how the way chatbots are introduced to people affects the way they treat these chatbots. And this was partly inspired by the fact that when Tay was launched by Microsoft, everyone described Tay as, the world's best chatbot, the most talented chatbot, the most proficient chatbot. And yet when we were sort of deploying our bot on social media, we were like, this bot is trying to learn through interaction. So, be nice to it. And you can choose to present your chatbot to people in a multitude of ways, right? You can say, hey, this bot is, a really well-trained professional, or this bot is really the best bot in the world, or this bot is, really not great, but it's trying to learn from interactions. And so we really want to see how these different ways of introducing bots to people can, shape people's expectations of what to expect, and how that might affect their evaluations of the chatbot, after they actually interact with it. And I think this is sort of a third flavor of HCI that's sort of come up in this third project of mine, which is, okay, one is you can try to project a future, write back a postcard to yourself and say what you should build and what you shouldn't build. Second is you actually build something that was not possible before. And the third is you take existing systems and figure out how people behave around these existing systems, right? So how do people behave with chatbots? How do people behave within social media? How do people view recommendations from recommender systems? And how might you redesign these systems in a way that is, provides people with more informed and satisfying interactions? So this is more about understanding how people, like you're not able to preempt how people will behave around something you built. And so once you build something, there are nice emergent effects that might arise. People might start to do interesting new things. And so you really want to try to understand, how people are behaving. So this was more, this project was more empirical in flavor, where, we would run a large scale study and then do some sort of statistical analysis of the outcomes. After this internship got over, our HCOM paper got accepted. But again, like I said, that is not really my project. And I came back to Kharagpur really nervous because the CHI deadline was coming up, right? And this project that I had been working on for the second half of my internship was really like my project. And so it was really important that I drive it to the end, finish hard, and, submit to CHI. And the CHI deadline was coming, and I really got back. And the project was scoped so that we would finish by the time it was CHI, and it took a lot of work. There were a lot of all-nighters. There was a lot of doing last-minute working before the CHI deadline, but somehow we managed, and we submitted my paper to the CHI deadline, right? And I was really proud of this because this was mostly work that I had driven, and I had sort of come up with the idea. I'd managed to run a successful collaboration. We submitted it to Kai, and I was just excited by the fact that we submitted. This is not an acceptance, right? You just submitted the paper. And now, if you notice, just since 2019 has started, if you notice, before 2019, Pranav has never written a paper. I have not published anything. And just after 2019 has started, I've written one helped write an HCOM paper, written this Kai paper. And so I had some sort of momentum going, right? Like I had just written 2 HCI papers. And if you notice, my Microsoft Research internship work is still going on, right, in the background. Like that is still like a looming project. And the issue there was once I had left MSR, a couple other people on the team had also left MSR. And so that project was sort of in limbo. But now I sort of had the momentum from working on these 2 projects. And I knew that, it's really important that you finish what you start. Like it's very important that you take it to completion. And so what happened was I was really just fresh off the board of this Kai deadline. I had experience writing HCI papers. And like I said, nobody else on that team was an HCI researcher. So now I had the most experience writing an HCI paper on that team, which is not to say I had a lot of experience, but I just written 2 papers while nobody else had written any HCI papers there. And so what happened was the CSC deadline was coming up in like a month. And so we decided that, let's finish this paper and write a submission for CSCW. And that is really fun because now I was sort of in the driver's seat there too. Because when we were doing most of the project, I was sort of helping another research fellow. So I was sort of like the second author on that paper. But now I sort of had the initiative because I was going to apply to PhD programs in a bit. So I also was naturally incentivized to finish everything that I'd started. And the second thing was I also sort of just had this momentum going. So we end up writing that paper. We end up finishing that project. We end up doing all the analysis for that paper and writing a submission to CSCW. Now, again, this is not an acceptance, but I was just really excited by the fact that I managed to, wrap up this project and submit to CSCW.
Yeah, I want to emphasize here to, the undergraduate, please. This is sometimes people think like the publication matters, but getting the real experience is more kind of the key to it, right?
Yeah, I would say that the paper will get accepted eventually, but just it's not in your control. Sometimes things are not in your control, right? How reviewers will respond to your paper. Sometimes they might just latch onto one sort of way you've written it. But what's in your control is putting in the work and making sure you're executing well and finishing your work. So, okay, now 2019 has been great so far. 1 HCOM acceptance, 1 Kai submission, 1 CSCW submission. But very quickly things start to not go so well. So we got our Kai reviews for the paper that we submitted in September, and the reviews were pretty bad. So they said if we got like a 2.515, which is usually a reject. And so we wrote a rebuttal. Michael was very insistent that I just go through the process. Like we knew it was going to get rejected, but you have to put in a fight, right? You have to take it to the end. So we wrote a rebuttal, and even after that rebuttal, the paper got rejected. So I was kind of sad, And shortly afterwards, I got my CSCW reviews, which was, again, not an accept. We got a major revision. So CSCW has a slightly different model where they either reject your paper, accept your paper, or if they think that it has potential but it's not quite there yet, they will tell you, here's a list of things we want you to change on this paper. So revise it, and then we will see. It's not a statement of acceptance. It's not you change this and we will accept it. It's you change this and then we will evaluate it again. And so, as you can see, I was really my emotions were generally the average of these 2 phases, which is not very exciting. Just quick refresher, nothing great. My both papers, one has been rejected, one has come back with a revise and resubmit. So Pranav's really not the most excited, right? Think of my emotions as being the average of those 2 phases, which is not great. And this is sort of where 2019 ended, right? 2019 ended on this note where one of my papers is rejected, one has a major revisions. But of course, this is not where things end, right? You have to keep persisting. And so it's 2020 now, and the first deadline of 2020 is the CSCW Giant deadline. And the thing with the CSCW Giant deadline is now I have the paper that has come back as a revise and resubmit. I have to revise that and resubmit it. And the other thing is the Kai paper that got rejected. Of course, we are going to revamp it and submit it again. And so this phase was mostly just figuring out what the reviewers said, right? Reviews are usually very, so a lot of people criticize reviews, as sometimes now, especially just because of the number of papers that get submitted, reviewers often criticize random things. But it's good to like filter out the noise and sort of see what they're actually saying. And sometimes there's really valuable feedback there. And so we really took all that feedback and we said, how best can we improve our paper. And so we really rewrote parts of our CSC, the Chi paper, and we ran a few more, studies to sort of tighten our observations and really drive home our results. And this was more incremental work. So it wasn't really, redoing everything from scratch. It was mostly figuring out, how best to write this, how best to communicate that, how best to, solidify these results. And so at the CSCW Jan deadline, now I'm submitting a version 2 of this Chi paper that is moved to the CSCW template, of course. But yeah, we basically rewrote parts of it and have a version 2. And the other paper, the paper that came back as, revise this, we have a version 1.5 of that. Because that's not been rejected yet, but there's still a lot of things we were asked to change. And again, now I don't know what the fate of these two papers is going to be, but I submitted it to CSCW, right? And finally, in March, right, after all of this, we got the good news that, okay, the Microsoft research paper that, we basically revised and resubmitted got accepted. So great, like we did the changes they asked us to and they thought it was fine after that. And so they accepted it. And the Chi paper that had gotten rejected, that I had worked on again and resubmitted to CSCW, now comes back with a major revision, which is basically again saying, here's a bunch of things we want you to change. After you change it, we'll evaluate it again. We're not saying we will accept it, right? So this sort of makes you a bit nervous, but again, I'm happy about the fact that, this first paper has been accepted. Yeah. So again, after this, we did the usual thing where, we revised, we saw what the reviewers were saying, we kind of rewrote the paper. So this is sort of emphasizing how important just science communication is, right? Like whatever research you do in whichever area, a big part of just doing research and getting papers accepted is communicating it well. And sometimes, what you're saying and what the reviewers are reading might not match. And that's often your fault. So sometimes we assign the blame to whoever is evaluating the work. We say, hey, they did not understand what we were saying, or they did not understand what we did. But part of it is understanding that they did not understand because you didn't write it in a way that could make them understand or could help them understand. So big part of this review, rebuttal, rewriting is just making sure that you're communicating things in a way that other people can understand it in. And so that's exactly what we did. And finally, this paper got accepted. This was in August. This paper ended up getting accepted to CSCW. And what also ended up happening, what was the cherry on the cake, was that we also got an honorable mention award for this paper. And this is sort of important I highlight this not to brag, but to sort of highlight the fact that this was the paper that got rejected at Chi, right? This was a Chi rejection that got a revise and resubmit and then finally got accepted at CSCW. And we got an award for that. And that is to say that, hey, the review process is random. So just because your work gets rejected or, it doesn't get immediately accepted, doesn't mean the work itself is bad. And what really matters, especially in doing research, at least in the HCI community, is persistence. Because like you would have noticed, right? Like oftentimes you're talking about the future, you're talking about, what you should build, how you should build, what is possible, what is not possible. And it's very easy to frame these things the wrong way, more so than in a technical field. Like if you say I've solved a problem X, it's very easy to understand, okay, is problem X important or not important? And okay, is the solution solving the problem or not? But in the HCI, it's often not as cut and clear, right? It's not as obvious what is the right problem to think of, what is the right way to think of a problem, what is the right imagined future, how might you get there? And so communication is a big part of doing research in HCI, and that's sort of part of what I've learned, at least through this process. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. The whole goal of this was to just sort of give you a sense of my progression in doing research, what I've learned along the way. I'm obviously not an expert at anything yet, but this is sort of my learning so far. And I'm happy to take questions around doing HCI research, my areas of interest, and also just doing maybe grad school also. So yeah, feel free to unmute, type your questions in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Yeah, I would encourage students who join today please, feel free to ask any questions, because this is, from the beginning I've been emphasizing this is very informal. Just use this time to learn. There's no judgment behind any of the questions. And also, of course, our well-known people who joined today also can ask any questions that you have. Use this opportunity to learn something new.
Yeah, so I think one thing I've tried to drill home in all of this, and has been an underlying message, but I might not have made it salient, is to break into a new research field or to really get opportunities, you have to keep asking. You have to ask for it, right? Like, you would have noticed that, when I was in my undergrad, I asked people for internship. That's how I ended up at MSR. Again, I mailed professors asking to host me. That's how I ended up at Stanford. So I think a critical skill to doing research in any area is asking questions, right? So you have to ask for information, as much information as you can get. And that's only then will people actually help you, right? Like, if you don't ask for it, you won't get help. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Like, there's no reason to be shy. Yeah.
Pranav, Dirukshi, can I go first? Is it okay?
Of course.
Okay, Pranav, I'm Indika. I'm from University of Morato. I'm actually currently attached to the academia. So one particular question, this is not about research, because I think even I discussed it with Ruchi some time back, because one particular problem that most of our HCI community in our country has is the ability to write up to a level of acceptance. They do, but still, shaping your paper up to that, because I would because I just went through your paper, which has been accepted and published. This is not unnecessary praise, but it was really, really good. And it when I read through among most of the other papers that I have read, your writing, the paper was written in very, very nicely. So it was very proficient. So, was there any specific thing that you do, that you did in order to get that paper into that level?
Right. I would like to emphasize that writing is also a learned skill. So the more you practice, you get better with time. Now, I would like to say that all the papers you've read of mine so far, you're probably reading more of Michael's writing or Ranjay's writing than my writing. So very often I would write the first draft, or I would write the first couple versions, and then they would come give me a lot of feedback. Then I would rewrite it. Then they would come give me more feedback, rewrite, and then I would rewrite it. And in the worst case, even if after my rewriting it would not be at that level, then they would themselves, change the framing, change the wording. But I do believe that I have gotten better with time. But I think the only way to really so there's two things here I would like to say. One is start writing early. So what happens, especially even in India, I've noticed this, is people will do all the work and then expect to write, 2 weeks before the deadline or a week before the deadline. As you know, we'll do the work and then we'll just write it. But it is often not that simple. So I think writing is very intricately tied to thinking also. So the earlier you start writing, the better it also shapes your ideas. So now, especially when I start out a project, early on I will write an introduction of the paper. So when I've just started a project, I'll first write an introduction, because that sort of makes it clear to me, what is how existing research deals with this problem, what is new about my approach, and it's just think of it more as writing a proof, right? Like writing an introduction or writing something is sort of a proof that you can then sort of scrutinize and say, okay, is my reasoning fine? Is my reasoning sound? So the earlier you start to write, the easier it is for you to define and polish your ideas. And the easier it is for you to communicate in the end, because if you've already thought about, how I'm going to differentiate it from related work, how I'm going to position this work, it sets up how you're going to communicate it in the end. So writing early is helpful. And the second thing that I would say is, as you start writing, when you start making certain claims, you will realize that, okay, your experiments don't support some of these claims. So what new experiments you might have to run to support that claim? So writing also brings up new experiments or new things that you have to do in doing the project. So what ends up happening is, if I do all the work that I think I need to do and then write, there is often this mismatch between what I've written and what I've done just because the thinking was separated, right? So I prefer this more continual way of writing where at the start of the project you write an introduction. Then when you do your first study, you write up the results, you write up the method section. That will sort of set the stage for, your next study in that paper, or tell you what other analysis you need to do on this data to write. But again, my writing is nowhere close to what you're reading in those papers. Of course, I think that is very polished
drafts, right?
by both Michael and as well as the senior faculty I work with. But of course, even they were not great writers from the get-go, right? That is a skill they've acquired over the career, over their PhD or over their career, and the only way to get good at it is to do more of it. And I would say just writing research is not the only way you'll get better at writing. I think a lot of you, especially if you're an undergrad, you should consider maintaining a blog where you sort of write about other people's research. So you can read a paper regularly and sort of write your review of that paper. So just the more you practice writing, the more you will get better at it. Like with any other skill, right? So I will say that definitely one way to, in the short term, fix or at least improve writing is to start writing early. The second is to just incorporate writing as a more long-term side activity. And of course, just to, when you're writing for a new venue, let's say it's the first time you're writing a Chi paper or a CSCW paper, of course, pick up some good papers that have been previously published there and read at least 5-6 papers, because you get a sense of what holds common. A CSCW reviewer has a certain expectation of what a paper will look like. A Chi reviewer has an expectation of what a paper will look like. Just format-wise, it's going to have an implication section. There will be a related work section. There should be some graphic of the system if you're building a system. So just doing some reading of papers in the space will give you a better idea of what a reviewer is expecting to see, so that you can sort of just write your paper in that format. But in terms of style of writing, I would say that comes more over time, and I also don't really have a solution for it yet, I'd say. Yeah.
Okay, any others have questions? Feel free to ask any dumb question as well.
Yeah, there's no dumb question. So I think a lot of these things are not obvious to me also, right? When I was starting, these are probably questions I had, right? Of course, fixing my writing was a question I had. I didn't even realize writing was important till I started. So yeah.
And I see new faces also. Akshika, you're not currently in Sri Lanka, or you are in UK, right? So probably you can unmute yourself. And also undergraduate students, graduate students and faculty, feel free to ask any questions you have.
Hi, can I go next?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I joined late. I'm sorry. So my name is Akshika. I'm a PhD student at the Open University UK. So my research area is in smart home privacy, mainly for the privacy aspect. So I'm almost finished, but I'm not finished yet. So my question is two-part question. The first one is where do you get the inspiration to evaluate conceptual metaphors? Because that's interesting how you sort of found that.
Yeah.
And then again, have you noticed any novel methods that you use for human-AI interaction evaluation compared to traditional human interaction? Those are the two questions.
Okay, so I'll deal with the first. So the first question was mainly, so when we started looking at, so the broad space that we were interested in was, why are people nice to some bots versus other bots? And we went to Jeff Hancock, and we were talking about it to him, right? And we also were brainstorming about, the whole thing that happened with Tay and things like that. So there were two things that really shaped that work, I would say. One was us asking how we form impressions of other people. So we first said, okay, maybe people form certain impressions of these bots, which is why they behave a certain way. So let's look at how we form impressions of one another, right? So how do people form impressions of other people? And there's this nice model in social psychology called the stereotype content model that basically tells us that we judge other people based on two dimensions that are warmth and competence. So when I mean to judge, how warm they are or how competent they are at whatever it is that they do. And that drives both my reactions towards them and my behaviors towards them. And so we said, okay, so maybe something similar is happening with bots. We don't know. But how might people form impressions of bots? What are the mechanisms that people have to form impressions of bots? What information do people have about bots to form impressions of bots? And a main mechanism that designers use, at least, to set expectations or to form impressions is these metaphors, right? And metaphors need not be text; it can be visual also. So, like, when you had Clippy looked a certain way, right? The way it looks is a metaphor. When you have this computing system, you have this desktop metaphor. Why is it called a desktop? When you have like a recycle bin, there is a trash can icon. Why is that? That is so that people think that, okay, this is where my deleted files go or my trash goes. So all these metaphors, visual, textual, audios. When you click a photo on your camera on the phone, there's that click sound that comes. It doesn't need to be there. I mean, it's not. It doesn't have any inbuilt mechanism, but it's just a metaphor so that people think that, okay, this is a camera, or people think, okay, this is a dustbin. So these metaphors are a powerful tool that designers already use, right, to communicate expectations and to set people's expectations. And so we said, well, what are the metaphors people associate with bots? A is how they look. So a bot usually has a picture associated, like Tay had a teenage girl's picture. But also it had a description associated with it, right? Like, hey, Tay is the powerful chatbot that is going to learn from interactions. It's the best chatbot we've designed so far, modeled after a teenage girl. And so we said, hey, maybe we just want to look at these descriptions and extrapolate from there. Like, sure, an ideal study would have looked at both what sort of pictures you attach, what description you attach, all of these things. But we said, let's isolate out one thing and see how people, assess the warmth and competence of these bots based on it and how that drives their behavior. So that is sort of how that took shape. And a lot of it came up through conversation. So the more we just talked about it, the more it surfaced, that, okay, we want to talk about warmth and competence. We want to talk about metaphors. And then we sort of just tied those things together. And could you repeat your second question? So I know you said, yeah.
Thank you for the answer for the first one. So the second one is, are there any specific methods that you've seen used in human AI interaction as opposed to traditional human computer interaction methods?
Right. Yeah, so in terms of methods, I think what is, so it really depends on what kind of work you're trying to look at. But I think one of the methods that I thought was really interesting was especially one that we drew on in our Microsoft research study, where, okay, like Wizard of Oz is a common technique everyone uses in HCI. But how do you Wizard of Oz? How do you prototype natural language interactions? Right, this is not an easy thing to do. Like, how do you prototype a chat, like a chatbot that, like, you can build a chatbot and have people talk to a chatbot, but how do you really prototype other natural language interactions? Like, let's say autocomplete. How do you prototype autocomplete? How do you prototype, these nifty interactions? And I think there was this really interesting paper by Chen Yang at Kai in 2019, specifically that won a Best Paper award, specifically on prototyping these natural language interactions. So let's say you're building a word processor. What new features you might want in this word processor, and how do you prototype them without actually building them? In HCI, some things are easier to prototype in a Wizard of Oz fashion than others, and I think natural language is really hard to prototype. But I would like to add that, since working on these projects, I've sort of moved away from the specific space of human AI interaction. So I think what happened in working on these projects was, I like, the concept of working on chatbots, and they seemed really cool, but I realized that I don't personally use them a lot. And they just seem like, these shiny objects that, everyone seems to be interested in, but I don't see like the practical utility, like where you would plug them in. And so now what I'm really exploring is, how do you have bots or really AI augmentation in group communication. So let's say you have group chat where people are either learning together or doing work together. How might AI systems be infused into this environment such that they can improve communication within these environments? So I think, yeah, that's. I don't have a satisfactory answer there. That's partly because I'm not actively thinking about it. Yeah.
Any others have any questions? Okay. Yeah. Since that, Yeah, thank you very much, Pranav. I really like the casuality that you brought. It's like conversational time, and it's really served the purpose as well. Perhaps I was thinking, like, the chapter that we are formed really young, and what we thought initially is like to have a reading group. I know that you are leading some groups, right? So could you kind of tell, like, how do you run those, and probably is it all in one? How do you sort of select papers to read, and what's the process?
Yeah, so I think running a reading group, I mean, the way you go about it really depends on what people's motivations are for being a part of that group. So, like with something where most people are beginners in the field, you might select a set of readings that you want everyone to be familiar with, or that might inspire people to think about these problems. With the reading group that I specifically run, it's mostly just me and other PhD students, both at CMU and outside of CMU. So we're open to having anyone join. But the way it works is we really try to just average out our interests, right? So let's say I'm interested in a certain area, someone else is interested in a certain area. We want to make sure that everyone's interested in this conversation. Everyone has something to talk about. And so we don't really want to come up with a fixed list that everyone has to sort of read through the year, because that might be very hard for people to do, especially when your interests are diverse. And so we usually run in like a weekly basis where, 1 week I decide, okay, I'm going to present this paper. I come present it. Everyone gives me so this might be a paper that relates to my area of interest, and then other people sort of give me their understanding and their perspective on this based on their area of research, which is very interesting to hear, right? Because it gives you a new framing for things that you're thinking about. And then the next week, someone else will volunteer to present a paper that they are excited about. And then again, we will sort of give them our perspective on it. And the main excuse for this group is, as you notice, that it's not very strictly furthering any of our individual research interests, but it's a good way to sort of scope out and get a high level view of what everyone is working on in HCI, what the trends in the field are. But it's also more an opportunity to just get to know other people, what their interests are, what their areas of research are. And to see if there are these interesting, new framings that they come up with, or new perspectives that they have on your work. But I think, especially if you're starting out, and if most people are newcomers to the field, then it might help to have some sort of guidance where you say, hey, this like month we're going to focus on social computing and we're going to read these papers, or this week we're going to focus on some other area and we're going to read these papers. But I think it really depends on what expectations are of people and like what they're. Yeah, so if anyone's interested, this is the group we run, and there's a list of readings there on the side. Oh, 1 second, sorry, it cut the link.
Okay.
And also, I don't know if this might help, but a while ago I wrote up my experience on applying to grad school also. So in case someone...
Okay. That would be really helpful, yeah.
The second link.
I know sure a few of the members here are interested in grad.
Yeah, so I think this was mostly just to sort of, the process is a bit mystified to people outside the US, especially in terms of who do you ask for letters, how do you write your SOP. So I thought I'd just like document my experience. Again, I mostly keep saying this, but all of this so far is my experience. None of this is necessarily typical experience. Other people might have very different experiences. And so the best way you can actually get a better sense of what is true is by talking to as many people as you can. So
I'll share this link with one of our team later.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. If others don't have, I mean, this is the last chance. It's 9:08.
If you're shy to ask questions now, or if you don't have any questions now, you can feel free to email me any questions you have. Yeah.
And perhaps we'll bring you again once, moving further, the three of us, so like we are kind of deciding to do a small reading group first, so that we can kind of write together in the long run. So we'll bring you down again to kind of...
I'm happy to come back and
Yes, Pranav. Thank you very much for doing this talk today, I could relate for many of the stuff that you talked about. And I'm glad that many of my students are here as well. They are second year students, but hopefully I would see some of them here in the fourth year as well. So that's a finally research kind of students. Right. And your experiences, I guess, would be really helpful for them. So again, right. They would not tell you that right now, but hopefully within another year or so, they would realize it. So thank you.
Oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think I have sort of seen your names somewhat, all of your names. So I'm hoping to read some of your Chi and CSTW papers in the next year.
So.
Yeah.
Atilina already has written many papers, so he's...
Yeah, no, I meant the students who are here. I'm hoping to read some of their...
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, right now they can't... So, yeah, could be a little bit dumbfounded, but...
yeah. Yeah, no, but...
yes.
Yeah, no, I genuinely appreciate the fact that you are trying to create a community, and I think that's very important, especially like when you're trying to create some HCI culture, that you start community and have these conversations. So I'm very happy to sort of help also.
Thank you, Pranav. Thank you.
Okay, with that, let's leave Pranav with his advices to improve research, and we will surely bring you down again, because I read the conversation style than like presenting a whole bunch of research at first, and it'll be really interesting to get your feedback once we kind of, narrow down our pieces of, areas. Okay. All right, then. Thank you very much. Those who joined today also, we'll keep you updated with the information and the mailing list, and we'll see you another week. Thanks all. Bye-bye. Thanks.